She stands 3 feet from me in the interview room. Beige walls, metal table bolted to the floor, a guard outside the door. I ask her why she did it, why she took my wrist in open federal court, in front of 200 witnesses, and pulled me onto her knee like she owned me. She does not deflect. She does not soften. She looks at me with eyes that have watched me for 6 weeks, and she says, "Professional propriety is a container I do not have enough of to hold what I am carrying." Outside that door, my supervising attorney is waiting. One word from me ends everything. Her case. My career. I do not say the word. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The courtroom was cold. That was the thing I would remember afterward, when the memory of that moment came back to me in the middle of the night with the specific reality of it. The temperature. Federal buildings run their air low. My skirt was a lightweight wool that did nothing to solve the problem. Her thigh was warm through the fabric of her tailored slacks, and the warmth was steady. And steady was somehow worse than sudden, because steady meant she had decided. I had spent 6 weeks preparing for the racketeering hearing of United States versus Moretti. I had reviewed 7 binders of financial disclosures, drafted 29 motion responses, cross-referenced grand jury testimony against 3 separate witness statements, and briefed the senior partners on discovery irregularities in the government's evidence chain. I had done all of this from a windowless office on the 18th floor of Holbrook Whitfield and Pearson, which was where junior associates were kept until the firm decided we were ready to be seen. I was not supposed to be at the hearing. Junior associates on federal cases were not brought into open court. They were not seated at defense tables. They were not, under any conceivable version of professional practice, brought forward to the client's chair and instructed to sit down. And yet, Serafina Moretti had walked into the client interview room 40 minutes before the hearing and told my supervising attorney, without lifting her voice above the register of ordinary conversation, that Miss Vega would be present at defense today. Not as counsel. As a personal accommodation, Margaret Holbrook was a name partner. She had been a federal prosecutor before she went private. She had argued 4 cases before the Supreme Court, and she had defended people whose crimes ran into the hundreds. She had, in the years I had worked for her, refused 3 separate senators' requests for scheduling adjustments with the same practiced calm. She said, "Of course, Miss Moretti." Then she looked at me, and her face said nothing at all, which was the same as saying everything. That was 90 minutes before the judge looked away. To understand how I got to that chair, you have to go back 6 weeks. To the Tuesday afternoon in October when Margaret called me into her corner office on the 34th floor and told me I would be assisting on the Moretti case. I remember the light. Manhattan in late October has a specific quality of afternoon light. The way it comes low across the river and turns the glass of the building the color of thin gold. Margaret was standing at the window with her jacket over the chair back and her sleeves rolled once at the forearm, which was the closest thing to informal she ever permitted herself. She turned when I came in. She did not smile. "Camilla," she said, "sit down." I sat. "You've read the Moretti indictment." I had. Every associate at the firm had read the Moretti indictment. 184 pages of federal racketeering charges against the head of the Moretti family, plus 12 counts of tax evasion, plus 3 counts of witness intimidation that the government had built around a cooperator whose credibility was, in my professional assessment, precarious. "Yes," I said. "The client has requested you," she said. I did not immediately understand. I heard the sentence. I processed the sentence. I could not connect the sentence to any framework in which it was possible. "The client," I said. "Serafina Moretti," said Margaret. "Personally, by name." "I have never spoken to Serafina Moretti." "I know." Margaret walked back to her desk. She sat down. She looked at me for a long, measuring second. "She was in the observation gallery during your moot court finals last month," said Margaret. I stared at her. "The firm invites clients to the finals when we consider them strategically appropriate. Miss Moretti attended. She observed you argue. She made a specific note of your name." "Margaret," I said, and I did not think about the fact that I was calling a name partner by her first name until it was out of my mouth. "Are you telling me that a federal defendant awaiting trial on racketeering charges attended a moot court exercise at Columbia Law and specifically asked for the third-year student who won it?" "She won it," said Margaret, without answering the question. "Why now?" I said. Margaret looked at me. The afternoon light did something useful to her face. It softened the edges of her professional composure and let me see, for just a moment, that she was concerned in a way that had nothing to do with the case. "She wants you on the file, Camilla. Research, document review, client meetings. She wants you present at client meetings. Junior associates do not sit in on client meetings with federal defendants." "I know. Then why?" "Because," said Margaret, and here she paused for a full 3 seconds, "because she asked, and because the firm cannot afford to lose this client, and because when a client of this weight makes a specific request about a junior associate, the correct professional response is to accommodate the request and monitor the situation closely." "Monitor," I said. Margaret held my gaze. "I want you to be careful," she said. "That is the entire content of what I am telling you. I am not telling you to refuse the assignment. I am telling you to be careful." "Careful of what?" She did not answer. I understood then that she was not going to answer, and that she was telling me to be careful of something she was not willing to name, and that the not naming was itself the warning, and that I was going to accept the assignment because there was no version of my career at this firm that survived declining a personal request from a client of that weight. I said, "When is the first meeting?" "Thursday," said Margaret. "Federal detention facility, downtown. You will accompany me. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will observe. You will take notes." "Camilla," she said. I looked at her. "She wanted you specifically. Do not forget that." I did not forget. The federal detention facility was a squat concrete building on the west side, the kind of institutional architecture that exists only to communicate that whatever happens inside it is not for the outside world's attention. We passed through 3 security checkpoints. I surrendered my phone, my keys, my earrings, and the small silver ring my grandmother had given me at graduation. The client interview room was small and beige and lit by the specific pale fluorescence that federal buildings deploy the way hospitals deploy antiseptic. There was a metal table bolted to the floor, 4 chairs, a camera in the corner that was, technically, turned off for privileged conversations, a guard outside a door that had a small window in it. Margaret sat. I sat beside her. We waited. Serafina Moretti walked in 7 minutes later. I had seen photographs. Photographs are not the same thing as watching a woman walk into a room. She was 38 years old, and she moved through the doorway with the specific economy of a person who did not waste anything, including motion. She was dressed in the detention facility's approved clothing, which for defendants of her particular category meant a dark navy suit with no belt and no laces, which should have looked institutional and did not, because Serafina Moretti wore that suit the way other women wore couture. Her hair was dark and pulled back into a low knot at the base of her neck. She wore no jewelry, which was correct for federal detention, and yet the absence of jewelry read as choice rather than compliance. Her eyes were dark. That was the second thing I noticed. The first was that she did not look at Margaret when she came in. She looked at me. She looked at me for approximately 4 seconds, which is a long time to be looked at by a person you have never met, and the 4 seconds contained an assessment so thorough and so unhurried that I understood afterward I had been read from top to bottom the way she would have read a document. Then she looked at Margaret. "Counsel," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Miss Moretti," said Margaret, "this is Camila Vega. She will be assisting on your matter, as you requested." Serafina turned her attention back to me. "Miss Vega," she said. "Miss Moretti," I said, "I have looked forward to meeting you." The sentence was delivered in the same register as everything else she had said, which is to say, quietly, precisely, without any particular emphasis on any word. And yet, "Thank you," I said. She sat. She placed her hands on the metal table. Her nails were unpainted and cut short in the way that women who work with their hands cut them, which was interesting because Serafina Moretti did not work with her hands. Or she did, and it was work that required nails cut short. I did not follow the thought further. I made a mental note. Later, when I had time to sit with what I had observed, I would follow it. Margaret opened the file folder in front of her. She began to walk through the discovery status, the motion timeline, the projected calendar for the bail hearing, the strategy for the government's cooperator. Serafina listened. She did not interrupt. I watched her the way I had been trained to watch clients. I noted the way her hands rested. I noted that she looked at Margaret when Margareta spoke, and that when I made small movements, her eyes tracked me without her head moving. Approximately 30 minutes in, Margaret asked her a question about a specific line item in the financial disclosures. Serafina answered. Then she turned to me. "Miss Vega," she said, "do you have a view on that document?" I looked at Margaret. Margaret was careful not to look at me. She was permitting the client's question. I said, "Miss Moretti, respectfully, I have not been retained to offer views. I have been retained to research and draft." Serafina looked at me. It was a very still look. "I understand your position," she said. "I am asking anyway. The document," I said, "is inconsistent with the corresponding entries in the third quarter internal audit. Whoever prepared it did not have access to the underlying data. The inconsistency runs in a particular direction, which suggests the discrepancy is not a rounding error. It suggests the document was prepared by someone reconstructing a paper trail without access to the original records." Serafina said, "Thank you, Miss Vega. That is helpful." Then she turned back to Margaret, and I did not speak again for the remainder of the 90 minutes. When it was over, and we were standing on the street outside the detention facility in the pale November afternoon, Margaret looked at me. "You gave the correct analysis," she said. "Thank you. You will be attending every meeting on this case for the duration of the engagement. You will draft the motion responses. You will attend the depositions." I nodded. "Camilla," she said. "Yes. Be careful." "Of what?" I said again. She did not answer. She turned and walked toward the car service that was waiting for her. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I thought about the 4 seconds during which Serafina Moretti had looked at me before she looked at Margaret. I thought about the phrase, "I have looked forward to meeting you." I thought about the fact that she had asked my opinion on a document she had already assessed herself. I understood, standing there in the November wind, that I had been introduced to a situation for which I did not have professional infrastructure. That the situation was going to require me to develop the infrastructure in real time. That the safest thing I could do, professionally and personally, was not to think about the 4 seconds. I thought about the 4 seconds all the way home. Over the following weeks, the pattern of the case established itself. Margaret and I met with Serafina twice a week. The bail hearing was denied, which we had expected. I drafted motions. I researched precedent. I attended a deposition of the government's cooperator and took 43 pages of contemporaneous notes. In every meeting, Serafina asked me questions. She was careful. She did not ask me questions that would displace Margaret or undermine the working relationship. She waited, always, for the moment in the meeting when the primary strategy discussion was complete, and Margaret was closing the folder, and then she would turn to me and ask something specific. Miss Vega, what is your read on the third witness in the grand jury testimony? Miss Vega, does the government search warrant application meet the particularity requirement? Miss Vega, if you were the prosecutor, where would you focus? I answered honestly. I understood by the third meeting that soft answers would insult her, and that insulting her would be a mistake I could not afford. She listened. Every time. She never wrote anything down. Whatever I said to Serafina Moretti was retained by her with the specific completeness that people retain information when they have decided that the information is important. She would occasionally refer 3 weeks later to something I had said in an earlier meeting, quoting me back to myself with the precision of a court reporter. She was learning me. That was the phrase that eventually formed in my head, walking home from the subway one evening in late November after the 7th meeting. She was learning me. Not the case. The case was Margaret's. Serafina Moretti was, meeting by meeting, systematically learning who I was. I did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. The associate I was closest to at the firm, Thea Morales, worked on the corporate side and had no context. My mother, who had raised me alone in the outer Bronx and had put me through law school on nights of prayer and days of double shifts, would not have understood in a way that would have helped either of us. I did not have a therapist because I did not have time. I had my own head, and my head was becoming a place where the 4 seconds had multiplied into a great number of moments, and where the moments were accumulating into something I did not have a professional category for. The 4th week in, Serafina made an unusual request. She asked, at the end of a meeting, whether I could remain for an additional half hour. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Then she said, "Of course, Miss Moretti, if Camilla is comfortable," and turned to me. I said, "Yes, of course." Margaret left. Serafina looked at me across the metal table. "You are wondering," she said, "why I asked to meet with you alone." "I am," I said. "I want to talk to you about your career." "I am not sure that is a topic I can appropriately discuss with a client." "Understood. Then let me talk. And you listen, and we will call it a monologue." I looked at her. Her hands rested on the metal table. Her dark eyes were on my face with the total attention I had come to understand was her baseline. "Margareta Hallbrook," she said, "is one of the finest defense attorneys in this country. She is also a woman who was shaped by an era in this profession that required her to shrink certain parts of herself to survive. She is careful in ways that will limit her ceiling. You are not careful in the same ways. That is an asset. It is also a vulnerability. I have been watching you for 4 weeks, and I have concluded that you have not yet decided which of those 2 things it will be." I said nothing. "I am not offering you employment. I am not offering you anything. I am telling you, because I want you to know that at least one person in your professional field has observed you closely enough to see it, that you are being underused." I said, "Thank you, Miss Moretti." She said, "You have not asked me why I attended your moot court finals." "No," I said. "I have not." "Why not?" "Because," I said, "I have decided that I do not want the answer." She looked at me. Something moved behind her eyes. "That is a defensible choice," she said. "Yes. You may change your mind." "I may," I said. She stood. She looked at me for one long second before she turned to signal the guard. "Miss Vega," she said. "Yes." "Do not," she said, "become the version of yourself that Margaret Hallbrook is. You are capable of something else." The guard opened the door. She left. I sat at the metal table for a long time before I stood up. I went home. I sat in my apartment. I drank a glass of the cheap red wine I kept for evenings when I did not have the energy to make choices. I thought about the 4 seconds. Then I thought about the 12 additional meetings I had now had, and the way she looked at me when I answered her questions, and the way her attention had, over those weeks, become the single most consistent presence in my professional life. I thought about the fact that I did not know whether what she was doing was recruitment, or whether it was something else, and that I was going to keep meeting with her regardless, because refusing was not a professional option, and because, if I was being honest with myself in the private hours of my own kitchen with a cheap glass of wine and no one to perform composure for, I did not want to refuse. I was not going to think about that last part. I decided, sitting there, that I was not going to think about it. I was going to do my job. I was going to research the government's evidence, draft the motions, attend the meetings, and let Serafina Moretti be a client. That was the professional posture. That was the posture I was going to maintain. I maintained it for approximately 48 hours. On the second Thursday in December, Margaret called me into her office at 8 in the morning and told me that the pretrial hearing on the government's motions in limine had been scheduled for the following Monday. She said, "Miss Moretti has requested that you attend. She would like you present in the gallery. She has been specific about this." I said, "Why?" Margaret looked at me. Her face, in the winter morning light, was the face of a woman who was reaching the end of her willingness to not say the thing she had been not saying for 6 weeks. "Camilla," she said, "I am going to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it honestly. Yes. Has Miss Moretti, at any point in your meetings with her, expressed any interest in you that exceeds the boundaries of the professional engagement?" "She has not," I said, "made any statement that would meet a professional bar for concern." "Camilla, I am answering the question you asked," I said. "I am asking a different question." "I know." Margaret held my gaze. She was on my side. She had been trying, in the constrained language of a partner protecting an associate, to give me the framework I would need to navigate a situation for which the firm's professional infrastructure had no clean answer. She said, "I want you to attend the hearing. I want you to sit in the gallery. I want you to be present in the courtroom because Miss Moretti has requested it, and because the client's request is one we accommodate. I want you to be aware, very aware, that Miss Moretti is going to see you in that courtroom. And I want you to have thought about what her seeing you means before you walk into the building." I said, "Understood." She said, "If at any point you become uncomfortable, you will tell me. You will not manage it privately. You will not decide it is a problem you can handle. You will tell me and we will address it and I will handle the client. That is my job. That is not your job." "Yes?" I said. She said, "Camilla, you are one of the best associates I have supervised in 20 years. Whatever this becomes, it does not become your problem to manage. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," I said. I walked back to my office. I sat in my chair. I looked at the small window in my office that gave onto a light well and thought about the fact that Margrethe Hallbrook had, in coded professional language, told me that she believed my client was interested in me in a way that fell outside the boundaries of the professional engagement, and that Margaret was going to protect me from the consequences of that interest if I let her. I did not know what I was going to let her do. 4 days later, on Monday morning, I stood in the marble entrance to the federal courthouse in a black wool suit and heels I had bought specifically for this hearing. I only knew that I was walking into a room where Serafina Moretti was going to see me, and that I had thought about her seeing me approximately every waking hour for the intervening 4 days, and that whatever I was about to do or not do in that courtroom was a choice I had made without allowing myself to name it as a choice. The hearing was in Courtroom 14A, Judge Diane Prescott presiding, Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Nunes at the government's table. Margaret and two senior associates from the firm at the defense table. The client, Serafina Moretti, in the client chair. I entered through the public gallery entrance. I sat in the third row on the defense side. I placed my briefcase at my feet, and my hands in my lap, and I did not, for the first 12 minutes of the proceeding, look at the client chair. I did not have to. I could feel her attention. She had turned in her chair when I entered. I registered it in my peripheral vision. She had watched me walk down the gallery aisle and take my seat and settle myself, and she had done it with the same total attention she had brought to every second of every meeting for the past 6 weeks. At the 12-minute mark, Margaret rose to address the court on the first motion. The judge began to speak, and Serafina Moretti, in the middle of the proceeding, turned to the bailiff and said, quietly but with the specific carrying quality of a voice that had been trained on carrying, that she required a moment with a member of the defense team. The judge looked at her. "Miss Moretti," said the judge. "Your Honor," said Serafina, "my apologies. I would like Miss Vega to be present at the defense table. She has been essential to the preparation of this defense." The judge looked at Margaret. "Miss Holbrook," said the judge. "Your Honor," said Margaret, "Miss Vega is a junior associate. She has assisted with the preparation, but she is not admitted to this court." "Your Honor," said Serafina, "I am not asking for her to serve as counsel. I am asking for her presence. As a personal accommodation, my understanding is that the court has discretion." Judge Prescott looked at Serafina Moretti for a long, measuring second. Judge Prescott had, in her 30 years on the bench, seen every conceivable variety of defendant request. She looked at Serafina Moretti and she said, "Miss Vega may sit at the defense table for the duration of this hearing, at the client's personal accommodation. Miss Holbrook, you will control your client's use of that accommodation." "Yes, Your Honor," said Margaret, in a tone that carried nothing on its surface and everything underneath it. I stood. I walked from the gallery to the defense table. My heels did not sound loud, but every set of eyes in the room tracked me across the 20 feet of federal marble. Serafina Moretti did not stand. She waited. She watched me walk toward her. When I reached the edge of the defense table, she extended her hand slightly, palm up, in a gesture that could have been an invitation to the chair beside her. I moved toward the chair beside her. She said, "Miss Vega." I stopped. Her hand moved. Not much, just enough. It closed lightly around my wrist. Her thumb settled against the pulse point on the inside of my arm, and she felt what my pulse was doing, and she did not release me. "Sit down," she said, and she guided me, gently, deliberately, without a single false motion, onto her knee. The room went silent. I have never in my life heard a silence like that. 200 people in a federal courtroom, and every one of them stopped breathing for the same 3 seconds. The court reporter looked up. The bailiff looked at the judge. The judge looked at Serafina. The judge looked at me. The judge looked at the papers in front of her. The judge looked away. Margaret made a small sound in her throat. She did not stand. She did not object. She looked at me and I looked at her, and something passed between us that was not language. And Margaret held my eyes, and I understood that she was telling me, without any word she could say aloud, that she would handle whatever needed handling and that I should, for the present moment, hold still. I held still. Serafina Moretti's hand was at my hip. Not gripping, just resting. The way a hand rests on something the hand has decided belongs where it is. Her breath, when she exhaled, moved against the side of my neck, warm and slow and deliberate, and she did it once, and did not do it again, because she did not need to. She had made her point. My skin was raised where her breath had passed, and there was no version of composure I could arrange over that fact fast enough to hide it. She noticed. I felt the quarter-inch adjustment of her fingers at my hip, And that was all. The proceeding resumed. I do not remember most of the next 40 minutes. I remember that Rebecca Nunes stood at the government's table and made her arguments on the motion in limine, and that her voice was tight in a way I could hear, and that she did not once, in the 40 minutes of her presentation, look at the defense table. I remember that Margaret responded with the polished, unhurried professionalism of a woman who had decided that the only way to survive the next 40 minutes was to pretend she was arguing a routine motion. I remember Serafina's thigh warm through the fabric of her tailored slacks and the specific smell of her, which was the trace of a perfume I did not have the vocabulary for, and something underneath it that was just her, just clean, warm skin under a fabric that had been pressed within the last 2 hours. I remember, more than anything, that she did not look at me, not once. She did not need to, because I was already on her lap in open federal court and there was nothing further to be established. At the 40-minute mark, Judge Prescott called a recess. The gavel came down. Serafina's hand, which had been at my hip for the duration of the proceeding, moved. Her fingers tightened briefly, and then released. She said quietly, in a voice that no one else in the room could hear, "Thank you, Miss Vega." I stood. I walked to the edge of the defense table. Margaret was already moving. She took my elbow professionally and walked me through the side door into the corridor. She walked me into the private client interview room reserved for defense counsel during hearings. She closed the door behind us. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I do not know." She said, "That was outrageous. I am going to file a formal complaint with the court, and I am going to move to withdraw as counsel, and I am going to have your name removed from every associated document within the hour." I said, "Wait." I did not know I was going to say it until I had said it. I said, "Wait. Before you file, let me speak with her." "Camila, let me speak with her," I said. "I need to know what she has to say." Margaret looked at me the way she had looked at me on the sidewalk outside the detention facility when she had told me to be careful. She said, "5 minutes. I will bring her to this room. I will be outside the door. If at any point in those 5 minutes you say the word stop, I will end this engagement and file the complaint and remove your name from the file, and there will be no further contact between you and this client for any reason. Do you understand?" "I understand." She left. I stood in the client interview room. Beige walls, metal table. The specific institutional cold of a place where the important conversations happened. The door opened. Serafina Moretti walked in. Serafina stood. She did not sit. She stopped 3 feet from me and she waited. I said, "What was that?" She said, "That was me answering a question you decided you did not want to ask 6 weeks ago." I said, "In a federal courtroom?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Do you understand what you have done to my career?" She said, "I do." I said, "Do you understand what you have done to Margaret? To this firm, to the judge, to the record of this hearing, to your own case?" She said, "I do." I said, "Then why?" She looked at me. For the first time in 6 weeks, I saw something behind the composure that was not the composure. It was small. It was, if I had not been watching, invisible. It was the muscle at the edge of her jaw tightening once and releasing. She said, "Because I needed you to know that I was not asking you a professional question, and I have run out of the professional patience required to ask it any other way." I said, "That is not an answer that survives a formal complaint." She said, "No, it is not." I said, "Are you going to tell me the rest?" She looked at me for a long, careful second. I understood in that second that Serafina Moretti had, over the 6 weeks of the case, made every decision about this engagement with the same total deliberation she brought to everything, and that the decision she had just made in the courtroom was not impulsive, and that the answer she was about to give me was one she had prepared. She said, "I attended your moot court finals in September because a woman I trust told me that you were the most impressive third-year student she had ever supervised, and that I should meet you before my life became complicated enough that meeting you would not be possible. I attended. I watched you argue. I made a decision that day about what I was going to try to do about the impression you made on me. That decision was to retain your firm's services after my indictment, and to request you specifically on my file, and to conduct myself, for the duration of the engagement, with complete professional propriety. That was my intention," I said. "And now," she said, "my intention has been overrun by circumstance." I said, "What circumstance?" She said, "The circumstance of watching you across a metal table for 12 conversations and discovering that professional propriety is a container I do not have enough of to hold what I am carrying." The room went very still. I said, "You understand that Margaret is standing outside that door, and if I say the word stop, this engagement ends and I will not speak to you again." She said, "I understand." I said, "Then why did you do it?" She looked at me. She was, I saw with sudden and complete clarity, a woman who had decided that whatever the professional or personal or legal cost, she was going to be honest with me before this hearing ended, because she had determined that I deserved the honesty regardless of what I did with it. She said, "Because the version of this in which I let you leave the courtroom today without knowing what I was doing is a version I am no longer capable of executing. And because if the answer to the question you are asking me is no, I would rather have it be no, while there is still time in this case for you to withdraw, and for me to accept counsel who has no connection to you." I said, "And if the answer is not no," she said, "then the answer is not no, and we will speak again, and I will not touch you again until this case is resolved, and I am a free woman or I am serving a sentence, and the professional obstacle no longer exists in either direction." I looked at her. 6 weeks of watching, 12 conversations across a metal table, the moment in the courtroom, her hand on my wrist, her thumb on my pulse point, the breath at my neck. "Sit down," I said. "I need time." She said, "Take it." I said, "I am not answering you today." She said, "I did not ask you to." I said, "I am not saying no." She said, "Thank you, Miss Vega." I said, "If you touch me again in a public courtroom, I will file the complaint myself." She said, "Understood." She looked at me for one long second. Then she nodded once. Then she turned toward the door. Her hand was on the door handle when I said, "Serafina." She stopped. She did not turn around. I said, "Why did you tell me all of that?" "In here. Now." Instead of waiting. She said, without turning, "Because I have watched you for 6 weeks, and I know that the version of you that would have gone home tonight without an answer would not have slept." She opened the door and left. The door clicked shut behind her. I stood in the middle of the client interview room and I did not move for a full minute. I counted, because counting was something to do that was not thinking. The fluorescent light above the metal table hummed at a pitch that was almost audible and almost not. Somewhere in the corridor, a door opened and closed. Someone laughed. Then Margaret came back in. She looked at my face and she said, "Sit down, Camilla, before you fall down." I sat. She sat across from me. She poured water from the pitcher on the counter into 2 paper cups. She slid one across the metal table to me. She said, "Are we filing the complaint?" I said no. She said, "Are you telling me that as a professional judgment or as something else?" I said, "I do not know." She said, "Then we are not filing today. Tonight you will go home. In the morning I will call you at 7 and we will have a conversation about next steps." She said, "One more question, and I want the honest answer, and I want it now, while it is still fresh. Yes. Did you consent to what happened at the defense table? I thought about it. I made myself think about it before I answered. I thought about the 4 seconds and the 12 meetings and the phrase, "I have looked forward to meeting you," and the specific completeness with which Serafina Moretti had learned me. I thought about her hand at my wrist and her thumb on my pulse point, and the words she had said, "Sit down," and about how my body had responded before my professional judgment had processed the request. I said, I did not stop her. I could have. I did not. Margaret said, "That is not the same as consent." I know. She said, "If you tell me now that you did not want what happened, we file the complaint tonight. There is no window closing on this." I understand, she said. "And if what you tell me is something else?" I said, "If what I tell you is something else, then we do not file the complaint tonight." "But I still come off the file." She looked at me. She was, for the first time since I had known her, looking at me the way an older woman looks at a younger woman she is trying to protect from a specific kind of thing she has seen before and has opinions about. She said, "That is the correct answer." I said, "I know it is." She said, "I want you to hear me say something. What Miss Moretti did today, whatever her intention, was a use of power that you did not have the professional standing to refuse, even if you wanted it. What she did in that courtroom was outside the boundary of what one person is allowed to do to another when there is a power arrangement between them, and you are not required to grade her on a curve because you liked it." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" I said, "I am going to know it more tomorrow." She almost smiled. She said, "Camila, you are going to be a very good lawyer." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Go home." I went home. Thea came over. I did not tell her what had happened. I told her I had a bad day at work and that I needed a friend in the apartment, and she came without asking any of the follow-up questions the specific quality of my voice would have earned from anyone less careful. She brought a bottle of white wine and takeout from the Thai place on the corner, and she sat on my couch and put on a nature documentary about penguins, and did not say a word for 3 hours, and I understood, sitting there beside her with a paper container of noodles I did not eat, that this was what love from friends looked like when it worked. Presence without questions. Nothing performed. Just the fact of another person in the room, so that you did not have to be alone with what you were carrying. I did not sleep. At 7 a.m, Margaret called. She said, "Are you filing?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you coming off the file?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I will notify the client's team by 9. You will not be involved in any further meetings, correspondence, or preparation on this matter." I said, "Thank you." She said, "If at any point in the next 12 months Miss Moretti attempts to contact you in any capacity, through any channel, you will tell me immediately." I said, "Understood." Serafina did not attempt to contact me. I learned later that at 10:45 on the morning after the hearing, Serafina Moretti had personally requested a meeting with Margaret at the detention facility. That she had sat across the metal table from Margaret for 22 minutes. That in those 22 minutes she had, without prompting and without any indication that the conversation was strategic, disclosed to Margaret a personal interest in the junior associate assigned to her case that had, in her judgment, exceeded the appropriate boundaries of the professional engagement. That she had authorized Margaret to file a written disclosure with the court on her behalf, waiving any claim of privilege as to the disclosure itself. That she had requested that Camila Vega be immediately and permanently removed from the file. That she had further requested, over Margaret's professional advice, that a copy of the disclosure be entered into the trial record. I learned this 3 weeks later when Margaret called me into her office and told me. She told me because Serafina had, in that same meeting, requested that Margaret convey to me, at whatever time and in whatever manner Margaret judged appropriate, that the disclosure had been made, and that it was not a strategic filing intended to compromise my career, and that no future contact between the client and me would be attempted without a documented request originating from me. Margaret told me, sitting across her desk on a Thursday afternoon in early January, with her hands folded neatly in front of her and her expression composed in the way she composed her expression when she was delivering information she had thought carefully about how to deliver. I learned this 3 weeks later when Margaret called me into her office and told me. Margaret said, "Miss Moretti has made every possible institutional move to protect you from the consequences of what she did." I said, "Yes." She said, "That does not undo what she did." I said, "I know." She said, "It is a form of accountability. It is not the whole form, but it is a form." I said, "I know." She said, "The disclosure will be sealed by the court, but it exists in the record. If she is convicted, it will not appear at sentencing. If she is acquitted, it will not appear in any subsequent filings. It exists so that if you ever, at any point in your career, are asked whether Miss Moretti's conduct on the day of the hearing was a violation, the record shows that she classified it as one and disclosed accordingly." I said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "She asked me to tell you one more thing." "Yes." She said, "Tell Miss Vega that I did what I did in the interview room because I owed her the truth and I could not construct a version of the case in which I got to give her the truth without also having taken something from her. I have now given back what I could give back. What I took, I cannot restore. I am sorry for the taking." Margaret finished the sentence and looked at me steadily. She was, I understood, quoting Serafina exactly. I said, "Thank you." Margretti said, "Is there anything you would like me to convey in return?" I thought about it for a long time. I said, "Tell her I heard her." Margaret wrote it down. She wrote it down on a legal pad in her small, precise handwriting. I said, "Thank you." She said, "We are done with this file, Camilla. You will not be in the building for any Moretti-related event." "Yes," I said. She said, "And Camilla?" "Yes." She said, "In a year, when this is over, we will talk about your professional future. You have a good one. You will not lose it because of this." I said, "Thank you, Margaret." I closed the door. The trial went to a jury 8 weeks later. I did not attend. I did not read the news coverage in real time. I had established, over the 2 months of my reassignment, a professional discipline of avoiding any headline that contained the name Moretti, and I maintained that discipline through the trial the way one maintains any discipline that costs something to keep. Thea, who had figured out approximately nothing about what had happened, but who had figured out that a headline was not something I wanted in the apartment, silently rearranged her news app so that when I stayed over at her place, I did not see anything either. The jury returned a mixed verdict. Serafina Moretti was acquitted on the racketeering counts, which were the counts that would have carried decades. She was acquitted on the witness intimidation counts, which had been built around the cooperator whose credibility I had, in a memo I had written in October, characterized as precarious. She was convicted on 3 of the 12 tax evasion counts, which was the government's fallback strategy, and which everyone at the firm had known was the government's fallback strategy since the discovery motions in November. She was sentenced to 18 months at a minimum security federal facility in Pennsylvania. She was permitted to self-surrender. Margaret called me into her office the day the sentence came down. She sat me across from her and she said, "Do you want to know anything?" I said no. She said, "I did not think so, but I wanted to offer." I said, "Thank you." She said, "One more thing." I waited. She said, "Miss Moretti asked me to convey, at my discretion, that she remembered what you said to her in the interview room." about not touching you in a public courtroom, and that she wanted you to know that the promise she made in the room extends to any and all courtrooms, and that she is a woman of her word. I said thank you. I did not cry in Margaretta's office. I cried in the elevator on the way down, in the empty middle of afternoon elevator, standing alone with my hands in the pockets of my wool coat. And by the time the doors opened at the lobby, I had stopped crying, and my face did not show it. I walked out of the building into the January afternoon, and I walked 23 blocks in the cold before I got into a cab, and I did not know, walking those 23 blocks, what I was feeling, except that I was feeling it, and that feeling it was permitted, and that I was going to be all right. 18 months. She self-surrendered on a Monday in February. There was a single grainy photograph taken from a distance of a woman in a dark coat walking up the steps of a low institutional building with her lawyer beside her and her head not lowered. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put the phone face down on the counter. I made coffee. I went to work. I did not, for the following 18 months, look at another photograph of Serafina Moretti or read another word about the resolution of the case. I made senior associate that summer. I made it 2 years earlier than the firm's normal track, which Margaret explained to the review committee was a recognition of exceptional performance on multiple matters, and which the review committee approved without dissent. I moved out of the windowless office on the 18th floor and into an office with a view of the courtyard on the 22nd. I was assigned 2 junior associates of my own. I began to first chair depositions. I did the work. I did the work with the specific attention of a woman who had decided that her professional life was going to be the container within which she rebuilt whatever needed rebuilding. Thea moved in with me in June. Not because we were together, because her lease ended and mine did not, and it was cheaper for both of us to share the 2-bedroom in Harlem. She took the smaller room. She cooked most weeknights. She sat with me on the couch on Sunday afternoons and watched documentaries about penguins and about deep-sea fish and about the way old buildings are restored. We did not talk about Serafina Moretti. We did not have to. Thea had figured out, without my telling her, exactly enough of what had happened to know what she needed to know, and she had loved me through the not knowing with a steadiness that I would spend the rest of my life being grateful for. At the 11-month mark of Serafina's sentence, I received a piece of mail at the office. It was a plain white envelope. It was addressed to me in a small, careful hand. There was no return address. Margaret's assistant, whose name was Pilar, and who had been at the firm for 23 years, and who knew everything without ever being told anything, brought it to my office personally and set it on my desk without comment, and left. I looked at it for approximately 10 minutes before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On the paper, in the same small, careful hand as the address, was written, Miss Vega, I will be released on a Thursday in September. I will not attempt to contact you before or after. If you wish to speak with me at any point after that Thursday, my attorney has instructions to accept a written request from you and to convey a response. You do not owe me a response. Regards, SM. That was all. I read it 3 times. I put it in the drawer of my desk. I closed the drawer. I did not open it again for 4 months. In September, on the Thursday she had specified, I did not do anything. I took the day off. I stayed in my apartment. I sat in the chair by the window that gave onto the courtyard, which had a maple tree that had already started to turn, and I watched the leaves for a long time. Thea sat on the couch across the room and read a novel and did not speak. Around 3 in the afternoon, I said, Thea. She said, yes. I said, if I write a letter today, will you take it to the mailbox for me? She said, yes. I sat in the chair by the window until 4. Then I got up. I sat at the small desk in my bedroom and I wrote, Miss Moretti, I received your letter in May. I have thought about it. I would like to meet. I do not know what the meeting is or what I want from it. I know only that not meeting is the choice I would regret, and meeting is the choice I might regret, and I would rather regret the second. I am available on any Saturday afternoon in October. CV Thea took it to the mailbox at 5. I did not sleep that night. The response came 4 days later. Inside was a single sheet with a date, a time, and an address. Saturday, October 14th, 2 in the afternoon, a restaurant on 12th Street in the West Village. On the morning of October 14th, I stood in front of my closet for an hour. I finally chose a plain gray sweater and dark jeans and boots. I put on the small silver ring my grandmother had given me at graduation, which I had not worn since the day I had surrendered it at the federal detention facility 18 months earlier. I did not put on makeup. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like myself. I took the subway. She was already there. The restaurant was small, half full, the kind of place that served coffee and simple food and did not turn tables. Serafina was at a table by the window. She was wearing dark jeans and a plain black sweater and a jacket over the back of the chair, and her hair was down, and she looked up when I came in, and something in her face moved that had nothing to do with the composed woman I had known. I walked to the table. She stood. She did not offer her hand. She did not step around the table. She waited. I said, "Hello." She said, "Hello." I sat. She sat. The waiter came. She said, "Coffee." I said, "Coffee." He left. I looked at her. She looked at me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. It was, I realized, the first time we had ever sat across a table from each other without a legal matter between us. Finally, she said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Thank you for waiting." She said, "I owed you the wait." I said yes. The coffee came. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She said, "I have thought about what I want to say to you for 18 months. I do not know that I have gotten it right. But I want to try, and I want you to interrupt me at any point if I am getting it wrong." I said, "All right." She said, "I have been thinking about the specific transaction that I performed in that courtroom. The transaction of touching a person in front of a room full of witnesses when that person did not have the professional standing to refuse me. I have thought about it, and I have named it, and I do not want to soften it. It was a use of power. It was, specifically, a use of the power imbalance between us to make a communication I did not know how to make any other way. That does not make it romantic. It makes it a violation, and I performed the violation on purpose, because I had decided that if I lost you as a consequence of the violation, that loss was information I needed and could not obtain any other way. I did not speak. I was listening. She said, "I have understood over 18 months that the calculation I made in the courtroom was a calculation I had no right to make on your behalf. It was mine to make about myself. It was not mine to make about you. And the fact that I made it about you and used the resources of a federal courtroom to make it is the specific thing I am asking you to permit me to apologize for, not for wanting you. That was mine to feel. For deciding, unilaterally, what to do about wanting you, in a public space where you had no clean way to answer." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I do not know if what I want to say next is a thing you want to hear." I said, "Say it. If it is a thing I do not want to hear, I will tell you." She was quiet for a moment, then back at me. She said, "I have thought for 18 months about what I would say to you if I got to say it. What I want to say to you today, if you will permit me to say it, is that I am not asking. I am giving you the information you would need to answer if you decided you wanted to. I am not requesting the answer." I said, "Tell me the information." She said, The information is that I have loved you since the moot court finals in September of the year before last, and that the loving has not diminished across 18 months of federal custody, and that if you decide at any point in the next 10 years or the next 30 that you would like to speak with me about it, I will be reachable, and that if you decide the answer is no, or that the answer is silence, I will accept the answer with the same seriousness with which I would accept any other answer, and I will not attempt to change it. I said, "That is a lot of information." She said, "It is what I have." I said, "I do not have an answer for you today." She said, "I did not ask for one." I said, "But I am going to give you one piece of an answer because I have been carrying it for 18 months, and I want to put it down." She looked at me. I said, "I heard you." She was quiet for a long second. She said, "Thank you," I said, in the interview room. "When you said what you said, I heard you. I did not know how to say it back that day. I am saying it now." She said, "That is a great deal." I said, "It is what I have." We sat. She drank her coffee. I drank mine. The restaurant filled slowly and then emptied as the afternoon moved on, and neither of us noticed the specific moment when the room became quiet. But at some point the room was quiet, and the light through the window was the color of late autumn afternoon, and we had not moved. I said, "I have questions." She said, "Ask them." I said, "What did you do with 18 months?" She said, "I read. I taught a class in the facility library on financial literacy, which was more useful to the students than the parole board thought it would be. I served my sentence. I was a well-behaved federal inmate, which is a specific skill set that I did not have going in, and which I now have exactly enough of to have not used it again." I said, "Are you going to use it again?" She said, "No." I said, "I am asking a specific question." She said, "I know. The answer is no. I have divested from every family interest that could reasonably have been characterized as non-compliant with federal law. I did this while I was serving my sentence. I did it because I had made a decision in the interview room in December of that year that I was going to be a woman, a junior associate at Holbrook Whitfield, and Pearson could plausibly imagine sitting across a table from without professional or legal risk. And that decision required me to make substantial structural changes to the financial architecture of my life. I have made those changes. They are documented. If you ever, at any point in this conversation or a future one, want to review the documentation, I will provide it." I said, "That is a lot to do in 18 months. She said, "I had time." I said, "And what are you now?" She said, "I am a private citizen with a substantial personal wealth invested in publicly traded assets and 3 legitimate businesses that I am in the process of restructuring under new management. I am not, in any operational sense, in the profession I was in when we met. It will take another 2 years. It is going as I had planned," I said. "And personally," she said, "personally, I have spent 18 months learning to sit with what I did to you. I have spent 18 months learning the difference between wanting a person and being entitled to a person. I have spent 18 months writing letters I did not send because writing them was useful and sending them was not. I have thought about you every day. I have not, at any point in the 18 months, believed that thinking about you every day gave me any claim on you. That is what I have done personally." I said, "And now?" She said, "And now I sit here, and I answer your questions, and I do not ask my own, because I do not have the right to ask my own until you tell me I do." I looked at her. She was sitting across from me in the late October light in a plain black sweater with her hair down and her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, a completely different woman from the one who had walked into the client interview room in the federal detention facility 14 months earlier. She was thinner. She was quieter. The composure was still there, but it was resting on a foundation rather than functioning as a wall. Her eyes, which had been dark and still and total in every meeting we had ever had, were something else now. They were open in a way I had not seen them open before, and the openness was tired, and the tiredness was earned. I said, "Do you want to walk?" She said, "Yes." She paid the check. She held the door. We walked west, toward the river. The West Village on a Saturday afternoon in mid-October is a specific kind of quiet. She said in the interview room, when I said that if the answer was not no, I would not touch you again until the case was resolved. I want you to know that I meant that literally and that I intend to mean it literally now. I said, meaning. She said, meaning that I am not going to touch you today. I am not going to touch you tomorrow. If we walk to the river and back and we get a car home and I take you to your building, I am not going to touch you at the door. That is not a rule I am imposing. That is a description of what I intend. I said, thank you. She said, when I touch you, if I ever touch you again, it will be at a time that you have decided is a time. It will not be at a moment. It will be at a decision. I will not blur the line. I said, all right. We walked to the river. We stood at the railing and looked at the water for a while. The Hudson in mid-October is the color of steel. A tugboat was moving downstream. A jogger passed behind us. Serafina had her hands in the pockets of her jacket. I had mine folded on the top rail. I said, I want to see you again. She said, tell me when. I said, next Saturday. She said, next Saturday. I said, same place. She said, same place. I said, this is going to be slow. She said, it is going to be exactly as slow as it needs to be. I said, are you going to be patient? She said, I have already been patient. This is a continuation of a discipline I have been practicing. I said, all right. We walked back to the restaurant where she had left her car. She did not drive me home. I had not asked her to. I took the subway, which was the correct choice, because taking the subway meant that the day ended with me and did not end with her. And both of us knew that was the correct shape for the day. At the subway entrance, she stopped. She said, thank you for coming. I said, thank you for waiting. She said, next Saturday. I said, next Saturday. I went down the steps. I did not look back, not because I did not want to, because I knew if I looked back, I would see her still standing there, and that would tell me something I already knew and did not need to prove again. I went home. Thea was on the couch with a book. She looked at me. She said, coffee. I said, yes. She said, you are all right. I said, yes. She said, do you need to talk? I said, not tonight. Soon. I went into my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took the small silver ring off and set it on the nightstand, and I looked at it for a long time. I thought about the fact that I had worn it to a meeting for the first time in 18 months, and that I had chosen to wear it to this meeting specifically, and that the choice had been about myself and not about her, and that the fact that it had been about myself was, in itself, the thing I had been waiting to feel. I lay back on the bed. I looked at the ceiling. I slept. We had coffee every Saturday for the rest of October. We had coffee every Saturday in November. In December, we started having dinner. In January, we started meeting on weeknights sometimes. She kept her word. She did not touch me. Not at doors, not at tables, not on any of the walks we took along the river or through the park. She did not sit close to me on benches. She did not put her hand on my back to guide me through crowded rooms. She was, in the physical register, more careful with me than any person in my life had ever been, and the carefulness was not distance. The carefulness was the shape her care took after 18 months of learning what care was. In February, I told Margaret. I told her in her office on a Tuesday afternoon. I said, I want to update you on something, she said. Are you updating me as your supervising attorney or as a friend? I said, both. I said, I have been meeting with Miss Moretti since October. On Saturdays. It has been consistent. It is not, and has not been, physical. It is a conversation. I do not know yet what it will become. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She said, Is she good to you? I said yes. She said, Do you trust her? I said, More than I did in October. Less than I will, if she keeps doing what she is doing. She said, That is the correct answer. I said, I am not asking your permission. She said, I know. I appreciate the courtesy of the update. She looked at me for a long second. She said, Is she still in the transition? I said, Yes. It will be another year, maybe 18 months. She said, And after? I said, After. We will see. She has not asked me for anything. She has not asked me for a relationship. She has not asked me for a title. She has not asked me for any commitment beyond next Saturday, which is the commitment I have made and continue to remake, week by week, for 4 months. She said, Camilla? Yes. She said, Be happy. I said, Thank you. She turned back to her monitor. I went back to my office. I did not, walking down the hall, feel like anything had shifted. Nothing had shifted. Everything I had been doing on Saturdays for 4 months, I had been doing with Margaretta's understanding already implied. Telling her was the courtesy. The shape of the thing had not changed. The first time Serafina touched me was in April. We were on the pedestrian bridge over the Hudson at the north end of Riverside Park, at the specific point where the bridge crosses over the river and gives you the view south to the George Washington. It was late afternoon. The sun was going down over New Jersey. She had walked beside me the whole length of the park without touching me, as she had walked beside me for 6 months without touching me, and I had stopped noticing it as an absence and started noticing it as its own presence. I said, Serafina? She said, Yes. I said, I would like you to touch me now. She looked at me. Her eyes did something I had not seen them do before. She said, Are you asking or telling me what you are prepared for? I said, Both. She said, All right. She turned toward me. She put her hand very carefully at the side of my face. Her thumb moved once along the line of my jaw. Her other hand came up and rested at the back of my neck, just under my hair. And she waited. She looked at me. She waited. I said, Yes. She kissed me. It was patient. It was earned. It was 6 months of walking beside me without touching me, condensed into the specific quality of not hurrying that only comes from a person who has decided that this is a thing they are not going to rush. Her mouth was warm and slow and completely present. Her hand at the back of my neck was steady, and her thumb at my jaw moved once, and I felt her breath on my mouth, and the warmth of her skin against mine, and something in my chest opened that I had been holding closed for 2 years. She kissed me, and she kissed me again, once, and then she stopped, and she looked at me, and she said, Thank you. I said, Thank you. We walked back across the bridge. We took the subway together for the first time. She rode with me to my stop. She did not come up. She said, Next Saturday. I said, Next Saturday. I went upstairs. Thea was making dinner. She looked at me. She said, Good day. I said yes. She said, You look different. I said, I feel different. She said, Are you going to tell me now? I said, Tonight. Over dinner. I told her over dinner. I told her the whole thing, from the moot court finals I had won in September of the year before last, through the 12 meetings in the detention facility, through the hearing, through the 18 months, through the letter, through the meeting on October 14th, through the 6 months of Saturdays, through the bridge that afternoon. I told her more than I had ever told anyone about anything. Thea listened. She did not ask questions. She refilled my wine glass twice. When I was done, she said, "Do you love her?" I said, "I am not going to answer that question yet. I am going to answer it when I am ready to say it to her first." "Not to you," Thea said. "That is the correct answer." The first public appearance we made together was in June, at a fundraiser for the New York Legal Aid Society. I had bought a ticket. She had bought a ticket separately. Neither of us had planned to arrive together, but we ran into each other in the coat check line, and we walked into the ballroom side by side, without touching, and if anyone noticed, they were too polite to make it visible. Margaret was there. She looked at me across the room, and she raised her glass. Once, in a gesture that could have been for anyone. It was not for anyone. It was for me. I raised mine back. At some point in the evening, on the way back to her table, she passed close to us, and she stopped, and she said, "Serafina, hello." Serafina said, "Margaret." Margaret said, "I hope you are well." Serafina said, "I am well. Thank you." Margareta looked at me. She said, "Camila." I said, "Margaret." She said, "Enjoy the evening." She moved on. Serafina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was generous of her." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have thought many times about what I owe her. I have not figured out yet how to convey it." I said, "You conveyed it by disclosing." She said, "That was owed to the court." I said, "It was owed to her too. She knows the difference." She said, "All right." We stayed until the end of the fundraiser. We rode home in the same car. She dropped me at my building. She did not come up. I went upstairs. Thea was already asleep. I stood at the window in my dark apartment, and I thought about the fact that we had been seen together, in public, and that I had not flinched, and that Serafina had not flinched, and that Margaret had raised her glass, and that none of it had felt like scandal. It had felt like being home. The following September, on the second Saturday of the month, exactly 2 years after I had received the letter in the plain white envelope at the office, I invited Serafina to have dinner with me at my apartment. Thea was out of town. I cooked. I made a roast chicken and a salad with pears and walnuts and a bowl of small potatoes with butter and rosemary. I set the table with the plates my mother had given me when I signed my lease. I opened a bottle of wine that was better than the one I usually kept. Serafina arrived at 7. She was carrying flowers, which was the first time she had ever brought me anything, and she was wearing a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled once at the forearm, which was the closest thing to informal I had ever seen her. She said, "Hello." I said, "Hello?" She stepped inside. She looked at the small silver ring on my kitchen counter, and she looked at the plates on the table, and she looked at the courtyard through the window, and she said, "This is a good place." I said, "It is." We ate. We talked about small things. She told me about a book she was reading. I told her about a case I was researching. She helped me clear the plates. She washed. I dried. It was, on every observable metric, an ordinary dinner between two people who had been meeting on Saturdays for a very long time and were now, finally, meeting on a Saturday in a place that belonged to one of them. When the kitchen was clean, we sat on the couch. She sat close to me, not touching. "Close." I said, "Serafina." She said, "Yes." I said, "I love you." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I know." I said, "I wanted to say it to you first." Before I said it to anyone else, she said, "Thank you." She reached out. She took my hand. She held it, palm to palm, on the couch between us. The way you hold something that has been given to you with the specific understanding that it is not the whole gift, and that the whole gift will not be given all at once. Then she leaned in, slowly, and she kissed me at the corner of my mouth, and then on my mouth, and her hand came up to rest at my collarbone, warm through the thin fabric of my shirt, and she stayed there for a long moment before she pulled back to look at me. She said, "I love you." I said, "I know." She said, "We are going to build something." I said, "Yes." She said, "It is going to be very slow." I said, "It is going to be exactly as slow as it needs to be." She smiled. It was the first time I had ever seen her smile. It was not the smile of a woman who had learned how to perform one. It was the smile of a woman who had lived long enough in the aftermath of her own decisions to find one on the other side. She stayed until 11. She did not stay the night. She kissed me at the door before she left. Once, warm and unhurried, one hand at the small of my back and the other at the side of my face, and then she stepped out into the hallway and turned to look at me one more time before she went. She took her flowers home with her, because she said she wanted me to have the vase without the flowers so that I would know she was coming back to fill it, and I laughed at that for the first time in her presence. And the laughing was the last piece of the day. I went to bed. I did not sleep for a while. I lay in the dark, and I thought about the years it had taken to get to a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled once, and a dinner in my apartment, and the words she had said to me on my couch. And I thought about the fact that we had gotten here honestly, in the specific slow way we had, and that the honestly was the thing. She came back the next Saturday. And the Saturday after that, we built what we said we would build. We built it slowly. We built it in a way that neither of us had ever built anything before. We were seen over the following years in public together at legal events and cultural events and quiet dinners in the West Village, and neither of us ever flinched, and Margaret raised her glass every time she saw us. And eventually, Margaret raised her glass at our wedding. I made partner 4 years later. I was, at that point, 34 years old. Margaret presented me to the committee. She said, "This is a woman who has done the work and knows the difference between doing it and performing it." The committee approved. Serafina at the reception stood beside me. She was wearing a dark suit that I had helped her choose. She raised her glass. She said quietly, only to me, "Congratulations, counselor." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Do you remember? In the interview room." I said, "I remember every second of the interview room." She said, "I told you that I would not touch you again until the case was resolved, and I was a free woman or serving a sentence, and the professional obstacle no longer existed in either direction. I want you to know that I have kept that promise every day since." I said, "I know." She said, "And I intend to keep it, in one form or another, every day of the rest of my life, not the not touching." The other part, the part where I do not blur the line, the part where I do not use what I have to take what is not mine. That part. I said, "I know." She kissed me, at the reception, in front of every senior partner at Holbrook Whitfield and Pearson, and half the New York legal industry, and the sitting Attorney General of the state. And none of us flinched. And she was right. She had kept the promise. She would keep it. The judge, whose name was Diane Prescott, had retired from the bench 2 years before. She sent us a card at our wedding, which was a courtesy neither of us had expected. It said only, "Ms. Vega, Ms. Moretti, congratulations, D. Prescott." I framed the card. It is on the wall of the small study in the apartment Serafina and I moved into after we got married, which is the apartment I still write from. It hangs beside the small silver ring my grandmother gave me at graduation, which I no longer wear because I no longer need to. I look at it sometimes. I think about the day in the courtroom. I think about the judge looking away. I think about the woman who took my wrist and told me to sit down. I think about the sitting. I think about the standing, later. Which is the part that mattered more. She is beside me most mornings when I write. She has her coffee. I have mine. We do not always talk. We do not need to. We do not always talk. We do not need to. She learned me across a metal table, and I learned her across 2 years of Saturdays, and we have kept learning each other every day since, in the specific slow way we agreed we would. The version of me that would have gone home the night of the hearing without an answer would not have slept. The version of me that lives here now sleeps very well.